Going to look then at the client-side API, and if I click in here, we can see this is just an act of reminding that we, of course, when we're working with CRM, we're dealing with a web-based product. So if I choose to log on, and here you can see I'm logging on into my install of CRM 7.3, and up pops the screen. Any screen that we see is obviously as a result of an HTTP request response cycle. I go ahead, make a request, and what we've got that is served up to us is a set of HTML with structures that any code that runs in here is going to be running within the scope of the browser, and it can access anything within that browser environment. And we've got this clear distinction between the code that is run and executed within the context of the server and code which is run and executed in the context of the browser. And that's this big division. When we saw in the lesson that introduced a lot of the JavaScript information and ideas, how where you are controls the different objects and structures that you can reference. As we go through, we are going to be looking at real examples from within inside CRM, and one of the things that we can do is to look at what is inside the product already. And if I switch back into the system and take us just to look at an example like a company, and then look at an address, and here click on an address, we can see that we've got a postcode field. This is the example I was dealing with in the very early lesson, showing us the idea that we've got an on-change example of code. Well, we are going to need to know where these are defined, and this type of behavior, chiefly when we come on to the definition of client-side code, is defined in essentially three different ways. We're going to first of all find that within a screen within a screen we can add in here the idea of behavior within the screen on the field. And if I look down into my address box long field, we can see that we have here the postcode field, and we can see that we can enter in the on-change script. And of course we have our custom content box, which is essentially a container that allows us to add in any HTML into a screen. So if I choose this and then navigate as a user, and here let's actually log on as a separate user. Let's get that record saved. And once the metadata has been saved, if I log on as somebody like Susan May and go off to look at a company, I'll jump in and look at Gatecom again and look at the address. We can see as we examine the address, there's the hello world that's been written out, and we know that this is another place where we can add in this type of client-side behavior. I'll come on to more about that in a moment. But within each of the pages, we're going to find that if we look at the actual source of the page, that rule that we saw defined at the level of the field has to be implemented and run or added as that rule into the browser. And as I look in the source code of the page, and I have a look for this, and I look for my on change, but still let's go on to address underscore postcode, we'll see the field, and we can see there the on change rule that has been implemented within the HTML of the page. Now that's clear, and that shows us one thing, but if we also have a look at the hello world, we can see that this is adding in to the HTML of the page. So that's the second mechanism of adding in the page of any HTML or any JavaScript that is going to change the page. But there is a third mechanism that we will be exploring, which is the idea that there are libraries of JavaScript that can be added in to the page, and we can look in here and we can see there are all sorts of different libraries of code being referenced, and you can see this by these script tags, which have all got the idea of the source reference pulling in information from a library file contained on the server. And we'll look at those again a little bit later on. But I just wanted to raise importantly in your head that we've got these three different places in which we can add in code, and it's added in a slightly different way in each particular environment. But as we are going to do experiments and play around with the code, if I just come up into the company and think about some of the things that we might want to do, we might want to start to play and experience and try out the client-side API. And the best way of trying this is actually to get used to using the console for the browser. Now, in the case of Chrome, which is the browser that I'm using, I would enter this by just hitting the F12 button, and you can see I've come into the console. Now, the console allows me to interact with the page that is currently on the screen to allow me to enter JavaScript. Now, I can actually use any of the JavaScript constructs. So, for example, I can say var my field. I can declare a variable, just like that. Or I could reference any of the I could reference any of the default objects which are relevant for the environment that we're in, which is the browser. So if I say my field equals hello world, so here's I've just created my own string there. We know that my field now contains hello world, so I've got a little bit of a programming environment. Now, the thing about this programming environment is that it is interactive with the current page that is on screen. So if I was to say window, which is the object within the document object model, which looks after the window idea, and then say window alert, and then write out my field, what we'll get is a little pop-up which says hello world. So here I'm interactively entering in plain old JavaScript within inside the console, but yet it's having an effect within the page that we're on. Now, that change is entirely, completely temporary. It's not making any change to the page. So if I OK that and then just reload that page, you can see that everything goes away. But it does allow me to create an environment in which I can start to play with the client-side API and introduce myself to some interesting ideas. Like, what is this all about? Well, it's all about providing us with a simple way of accessing key structures and objects within inside the interface which are meaningful to Sage CRM. So one of these is that we saw how we could use window.alert, but there are objects which are provided to us within inside the browser. Now, one of these would happen to be something like the current user object. Now, we've seen an implementation of the current user object within inside the create script, so we know that there's a current user object which is created server-side, but actually within inside the browser, it's also created. So if I enter in current user here, and I say user underscore display name, we can actually see which user we're currently logged on as. And I can combine that with the types of behavior that I already had. So let's have a look at window.alert, and I can then say, write out my current user, user underscore display name, and you can see that I've popped up my little message saying who's logged on. Now so far that's interacting with the structure of the page in the case of the current user, but it's not actually interacting with the flow of the HTML of the page. Well, this is where we start to be aware that there's a whole set of documentation that we can reference within inside CRM. So I'm just going to go off to help.sagecrm.com, and I'm going to go into the on-premise help, go into English, and run down into the system administration help, system administrator help. Now that's quite important to come down into the administration help, because this is a sort of, it's an API that is available to system administrators to use, although you might argue that really it's a fairly development focused thing. It's actually very straightforward, and we already cover some of the topics like advanced screen customization, which are all about the creation of those views. So here we are in the System Administration Guide, and we've got this ability to enter in the client-side API reference. And if I just shift the menu over to the left, we can see that we've got ways of starting to understand what this is offering us. Now, if I look on the CRM menu, you can see there are lots of different ways in which we can reference information about CRM, the instance of CRM and the screen of CRM that we're using. And we'll look at some of these in detail, but they pay attention, it pays us to look and understand all of these different little things just by researching and looking through each of the methods in turn. Now notice, look, you've got little things here about adding buttons in and hiding buttons in, hiding tabs, and you can start to see that this is all about making the interface of Sage CRM very controllable. And so one of the things that we can do is know that we can affect the sorts of messages that get displayed on screen. What do I mean by that? Well, look, if I click on here, change, now this is just using the default behavior, and we know if I take the value of company name away and try and save, we'll get an error message. We'll get an indication here that there is a validation. And if I go off to a case, for example, very clearly, this is a little bit more obvious if I go into a case. Let's do this as a system administrator. If I go up here into a case and I try and change this and take away the service level agreement here, service level severity, and choose save, you'll see that I get an error message displayed on the screen. Now, wouldn't it be nice to be able to either highlight the field or provide an error message into the structure? Well, actually, the client-side API allows us to do that pretty easily. So if I just cancel that and look at this field, I can go back into my console again and introduce you to the idea of the library that contains the client-side API. Now, just as I typed in window to get into a sort of namespace area, here I would type in CRM, and then I can start to reference the items that are within inside the structure here. So if I type CRM and I'm looking at something like the idea of the error message, we can see that I can put error message and then whatever error message I want to do onto the screen. So in fact, what I can do here is type in error message, and I might want to write out for my current user the user display name, and you can see that I've written out the error message onto the screen. And if I want to get rid of it, well, that's just a question of resetting it to false, and you can, oops, that's not quite right, false, and you can see that I've taken away that error message by using the Boolean. So I can turn on, turn off error messages that I want, and I can start to control different screen elements. Now, the fundamental screen elements, or the main sort of screen elements that you're going to want to control, are the fields, the buttons, the tabs, And in the case of something like the opportunities area, you'll want to control columns and individual rows. So all these are accessible and controllable, and it's quite fun to be able to tell the difference as to whether you are working with the field that is here in view mode, or whether we are working with the field in edit mode. And if you remember back to the last lesson, we actually discussed how you could use things like the action code to start to work out which mode we're in, and we'll meet in a moment at one of the mechanisms that we can do that. So let's actually start to see about selecting and working with fields. And so I mentioned that I can set up and use sort of objects for my own sake inside here, and I can say var my field equals, and what can I do in here? Well, what I can do in here is to say crm.fields, and I can mention the name of the field that I want to use, and here this will be comp_name, and I got now that field, my field. So inside my field I can reference different things. So I can tell you what value it contains. I can also, if it's a field that I want to be able to bring the attention to a user, I can start to use the idea of a highlight. So I can highlight it, and if my favorite color happens to be red, I can highlight it in red, although perhaps actually I may want to turn that off. So I'll turn that off and put back on just the default, which is yellow. So you can see that you've got different ways of working with the field. And if it's not just one field you want to work with, you can work with a whole set of fields, because the selectors allow you to actually specify a range. So here I'm going to specify my fields, plural, and just name a few fields. So let's actually name here type, and I'll use comp_SLA ID. So I've got now a couple of fields referenced there, and if I want to handle those fields in a particular way, so if I say my fields dot, and let's well, hide them, you can see I've turned off those fields, and if I want to turn them back on, it's a question of just saying show, and I can turn them off. And I can even be really quite clever, because here you can see that I can do something called fade out. You can see that they've faded out and the gap has closed up, although that's particularly, it's a little bit awkward to fade it out. It looks a bit like a sudden shift out, but we can bring that back in, fade them in, and you can see how they've come back in. Or in fact we can just collapse them. So I can collapse, and there, they were never there, but they are there. You see, that's one of the things. So this is one of the ways in which we can start to play, and it's important to realize that we are playing, because if I refresh this, no change has actually been made. But what I've done is I've got used to selecting and finding and controlling the fields that I can then add that ability into the actual create scripts and onto the onChange scripts and onto the custom content and into the script libraries that I might want to make. You can see it's worthwhile revising all of these slides when you download them after the end of the training. You can get hold of these slides, and they'll remind you of the different ways in which you can select different fields and then carry out those different tasks. So you've got lots of different things that allow you to control aspects. To remember the interesting thing about one of the things that we looked at in the last lesson was taking for a person record, and we looked at a person record and how we could add in a new field which would display a picture held for that person in the library. Well, in the same way, you can do that. You don't have to use a server-side method to do that. You can use that using a client-side method, so you can actually find out the path using the client-side mechanism, and you can see inside the help. If we look at the idea of CRM, you'll see that there is in fact a idea of being able to look at a field and convert a URL to an image. And so you've got all the documentation which will show you how you can start to do that. That's just an interesting idea. There are some blog articles that discuss this sort of behavior up on the community. Now we're obviously getting to the point where we're going to do some proper writing, proper work. So let's actually put what I'm starting to show you into some form of context. Back in version 7.1, which is still a supported version of CRM, we're supporting 7.1, 7.2, 7.3, but 7.1, the very early version, doesn't support any other browser other than Internet Explorer. So plain old JavaScript was entirely our option that we would use, and we would have to be writing it for Internet Explorer. Well, when version 7.1 SP2 came out, that introduced the idea of multi-browser support, and developers had the choice of either using jQuery or carrying on to write cross-browser code. Now we'll see in a moment what that means, but if I just look at any page inside CRM, if I view the page source and look down here, you can see that Sage CRM is adding in as its library. You can see reference to the fact that it's adding in jQuery into the interface. So jQuery underlies actually our own API. So any of the mechanism that we're using for Sage CRM's API actually itself is dependent on jQuery as this JavaScript library. The purpose of jQuery is to make selection of objects very easy within the interface, and Sage CRM has a very particular structure of objects, so it's a fine-tuning to make it really easy to identify what's a tab, what's a button, what's a field, what's a column, what's a row inside the structures of the page. And we have got, therefore, from version 7.2, this idea of the client-side API. Now, what we have got on these slides is a development really of the idea that we might have had if we are working inside a lead screen trying to control behavior. So if I jump across into a lead screen, let's go and find here a lead, one that is still in progress, or a new lead. There we are. Jump across into Dixon Baptist, and as we look on this screen we can see that this is assigned to Fred Jones. I'm the system administrator looking at a record that belongs to Fred Jones, and we can see that there's a button that says Convert to Opportunity. Now, I don't know whether you can see this. If I'm looking at the bottom of the screen, you'll see that the URL references a function called Validate Company Entry. Well, if I was writing just script focused on Internet Explorer, then I could use the fact that the button calls a URL that contains that literal string of Validate Company Entry. And that's what the code on the left is doing. You'll notice it's using this idea of window.attachEvent. It's attaching a function to the event of when the page has loaded into the interface. But attach event is Internet Explorer specific. So when we come on to thinking about Sage CRM 10.1 SP2, we have to be thinking about Chrome and Firefox and Safari, and we can't just use attach event because that is specific to the implementation of JavaScript within Internet Explorer. All the others use add event listener. And so if we look to where we've got window.add event listener, then add event listener calls a particular function, and you'll notice that even the event has a slightly different name. One is load, one is onload, but more or less the same thing is being done where we are looking for the element. In this case, we're finding it by the tag name and then setting the gain, hiding the visibility using style visibility. With jQuery, though, we would change tack as to what we're going to do. jQuery is all about using different forms of selectors to be able to identify the controls that you want to be able to change, and then controlling the property. And in this particular case, you can see one selector is allowing us to make a comparison to see what is the field that contains the information about the assigned user ID compared with the current user information. So just doing a comparison to see whether they're the two are the same. If they're not the same, then what we're doing is then going on to look for all of the hyperlinks which contain the string validate company entry again. And if that's the case, for each of the ones, they're applying onto that a function that will hide the particular tag that has been actually identified. Now, the thing about jQuery is that, one, not everyone is particularly comfortable reading jQuery, and two, it has an underlying assumption is that the HTML of a particular page is not likely to change and not to be very dynamic, and if it is, it's going to be predictable in the way that it changes. Unfortunately, in Sage CRM, when we move from version to version, and the move from version 7.2 to 7.3 and the introduction of the new contemporary theme is a case in point, we cannot make the assumption that our HTML that is generated is going to remain the same or is going to change in a predictable way between versions. Consequently, the idea of the API is to mask, this is the client-side API, is to mask all those potential changes, take them in the stride, and so we don't have to worry about it. If we use the methods of the client-side API, we don't have to worry about how things are changed. Just by asking us to hide a button or find a button, then that will work. Now this particular thing is like really easy to understand. If we take that information on the right hand side, we can see that we've got this crm.ready. This is a function that, a bit like the jQuery, we've got the jQuery constructor there with the dollar, which is where we're passing in code and it's automatically applying to the jQuery object the sense that this code is going to be applied when the page is loaded, but we're not mentioning any type of browser because it's jQuery that looks after it. crm.ready is doing that for us. It's going to allow us to just pass in our own method. We don't have to worry about which browser we're using. That's all masked from us, and just by saying I want to reference a function, the function here contains a call to hide a button. Means it's really good. Just a note about hide button as a method. You can see that hide button method uses the idea, if I jump across, well, let's stay here, you can see here where I've got convert to opportunity. Well, convert to opportunity, it's assuming is a button called new opportunity.gif. Well, very clearly in the contemporary theme, we're not using using buttons. It's a pretty good idea. If I go and log on as another user, and here you can see that I'm logged on as my Susan May. If I change my preferences, it's called change, I can change my preference to use instead the Sage theme. And so now if I look at this and log off, log on as Susan May, you can see I've changed back to this, and on a screen like something like the opportunity screen, I can see the button. So if I open the image on a new tab, you can very clearly see what the name of that particular image is called, and this would allow me on a page like this, knowing that, to say, oh, what I can do is say crm.hide button, and then name the button. And it's case sensitive, this, by the way, because in this particular case it is case sensitive. Look at the fact that if I pull this down, there's the button. If I look at my code, hit return, the button disappears. It's not actually disappeared, as in it's not removed, it is just hidden, because I can use the flip of that and say show button, and I can turn that button back on. Now please be aware that I can only hide a button or show a button if the user has permission to use that button in the first place. So I just did that with the new button. Imagine I'm using a different user. For example, I might log on here, not as a sales user, but by a support user. And if I go onto the opportunities page, we can see I certainly don't have a new opportunity button. This all means that if I enter the console for this particular user and try and say crm.show button, it doesn't matter what I put in here, it will not show that. No matching images restored, because simply there is no reference to that in the underlying HTML of the page that I can possibly change. So you can't actually use the client-side API to give somebody permission that they're normally denied access to. You can't break the security rules with the client-side API by saying, of course you can see this. There are things that you can do to change and be more sophisticated within this, and and the particular view that the particular rule that you're doing here is quite a sophisticated thing, because you're saying, well, normally a user is allowed to do this, but in this particular circumstance we're going to hide the button so that they don't do it. But it's not an absolute prohibition of creating a new opportunity. Okay, now before I go on, let's see if anyone has got any questions. I don't think any questions have been asked. I just want to give you the opportunity to shout out. Well, no one has shouted out anything, so what I'll do is I'm going to carry on with this, and we're going to look at the idea of field level scripting using the onChange event. So this is getting quite practical into how we implement particular rules. Now remind us of the fact that we can add in our code as a system administrator into our screen, and of course when I look at a screen like this, I can reference anything within the document object model. So my scope of reference is enormously wide. Anything that is within here, I can even extend that with Ajax as well, and we'll see in a moment some of the ways in which we can do that sort of behavior. But if we are going to explore the sorts of things that we can do, then we need to know what's inside our database. What are the examples that we can reference? And so I've switched over into the Management Studio, so I want to create a query and I want to look down and I want to introduce you to some very important tables within inside metadata. This is basically going to allow you to see where client-side code is used, and the reason for doing this is not only to expand your background knowledge of Sage CRM, but also to get you thinking about these are areas where you need to investigate if you think that you should consider refactoring code as you're approaching an upgrade. So if I choose here, say use Sage CRM 7.3, which is the database that I've got, and I now say select star from, and the table I'm interested in is custom underscore screen objects, and as I look to that we can see all of these different screen objects, and there's a field in here called C obj underscore custom content, so I can say where C obj underscore custom content is not null, and you can see that we've got a few fields that have got a definition for some form of content being defined. It's a little bit sparse, but it does show that a function is being defined within a couple of screens. Now that's showing us that the custom content within the screens and the lists that might be defined inside the system. You can see that one is a screen and one is a list. We can also see where the on change rules are defined, and that's not inside custom screen objects, but instead is inside custom screen. So select star from custom screens, and as I look to that, what we'll find is that all these columns have the prefix of CAP, and I can read across and I find my field CAP on change script. So where CAP on change script is not null, and this is allowing us to see the scope of all of the client-side code that sits within the default system. So there's actually quite a lot of on-change behavior going on inside the system. And you can see here that there's reference to pseudo URLs as well. So the idea that you on change, it will invoke a function that sits within inside the system. That's pretty good. Now, if I take this idea a little bit further, I can start to add in my own functions, but really I think they come into their own when you're starting to reference information that is held in the custom content. Now, custom content is brilliant. Custom content allows us to add in any HTML that we want. Now I'm going to get rid of that particular custom content because I want to put it in another screen. I'll put it into the company screen. But you saw how I had written Hello World as plain HTML or plain text into the custom content, and it was added therefore into the stream of the page that was generated out into the interface. But I'm looking at the company now, I look at the screens, and there's my company box long. In this case, what I want to do is to write a little bit of HTML, and I'm going to use just marquee, and I'll put in Hello World. And our marquee is a terrible tag. This is not to be used in the real world. It's an absolutely terrible tag, but the point is it's quite fun. So if I now close the console for this, and as my user go into the company, this is the user Susan May, she's using the old style, and my other user here goes into a person and then up to the company, and they're using the new style. There's the hello world being written out. In the case of the new style, we can see how that's written out as well. So the old style and the new style both allowing us to write out the information into the screen. That's fun. That's a good thing. But can we go and do even more clever bits of behavior? Well, the answer is yes, we can. Consider this. If we don't want a marquee hello world, but what if we want to get to the point where we are looking at the idea of a communication? So if I consider a communication screen and I look at a communication, do you notice how we've got at the bottom of this follow-up actions, checkboxes? Well, wouldn't it be nice if I was working on a screen like this, that if I was in edit mode, that I could have a field on the page that when I saved this, like I've got my opt-out checkbox here, this is an additional one that would allow me to do different tasks that not held, this is not data that's being held into the system, but I could then react to. Well, as a system administrator, what I can do is I can go into company box long, and since I can put in any HTML I like in here, I can actually construct something like this. Well, if I just use a text editor to do this, let's go and put a font that you can see, and I put in, oops, let's go into input, type name equals, let's put this as oppo and comp underscore test field, and I'll also put in the value to be, let's put in, yes, let's put the value to be hello. And I just put that as a field. I could put in the field type if I wanted. By default it'll be treated as a text field, but if in here, if I paste that in here, this is showing you that when I choose save, once that's chosen save, I can then choose to go to a company, and on this screen we can see our hello field. Now, how can I get away? If I was going to click change and I wanted to enter a value and then do something with that value, where would I get hold of that? Is it a real value that's being submitted? Well, actually, this is a real field within the form, and it can be accessed. And if I come back into this company area and use a table level script, so this is a server-side script. This is all about the idea that we're up in the browser, we're changing dynamically the things in the browser, submitting additional data as a field to the server. The server can nevertheless grab hold of those, even though this field doesn't exist inside the database. So let's just call this company script. I'm going to be talking about table level scripts in the next letter, but I'm going to call this company script. I don't need a user logon for this, and what I want to do is to have an update function, and my update function is going to be set to be valid equals false, because I want to write out an error message, and the error string This, you know about valid and error string because of the create scripts that we were doing, but here I can use form values, and I can read the value of the inbound oppo test field. So I can actually read out whatever's been submitted. So if I save that, and over here change that to be hello world and save, what we'll get is nothing. Let's do that again. Let's click change and say hello world and choose save. Oh, that hasn't triggered. Why hasn't that triggered? Maybe I didn't call it oppo test field. I have to make sure that the field is the correct name, so let's have a look at my element, comp test field, and of course I called it oppo test field, so that was very stupid of me, completely wrong field name. So if I choose save there, over here now, if I change this by clicking change, click hello world and choose save, what we're seeing is that I am it snuck in a Windows domain user there. What we're doing here is if I click change and choose save, what I'm doing is I'm submitting my value, and this is then being read and written out again. So this is an extremely useful little technique to allow us to put in information into the page that can then be submitted and read, but I am not making any physical changes to the data model to allow us to do that. This is entirely dynamically creating the fields, which are in like control fields for the system. Okay, so that's one of these is that we can put to, is seen that we can put in any HTML tag that we want. We can put in interesting things like inputs, and I've seen people use iframes within the page. Just a note about styles is that with the new contemporary theme, it's much more difficult to override the themes, because many of the theme options are set by aspects of not just the cascading style sheets, but aspects of code that is then forcing on the style changes. So you can't just simply change a style by adding your own local style into a page. But that's one of the ideas that we have got. We've got all these different things that we can do, and probably the most useful purpose of the custom content, though, is not to do these little clever things with HTML by putting in your own fields. It is actually to look at the custom content and say, well, tell you what we're going to do is we're going to add in here a function, and let's get rid of that. The function that I'm going to do is I want to look at controlling the behavior around the entry of data into the name fields of a person, and I'm going to use a little snippet of code that's here. It's just the check case function. It's straightforward. The idea of check case is that we pass in a value. It will then look and deconstruct it to see what the first character is and what the remaining characters are, and are they corresponding to the pattern of the initial uppercase letter, and everything else should be lowercase. Now, it's not perfect. It's going to be caught out by names which are like O'Driscoll and O'Toole and or the names which are double-barreled names, two names within one. So it's not brilliant, but as a very simple rule, it demonstrates a particular point. I can take that function and I can apply it inside CRM. So let's actually do that. Let's pick up my function here and come into customization of the person screen and look at the idea of the person box long. Now this is defining a function that is then loaded and run as the page loads, but it's then going to be referenced later on. And that's fine. We're just defining a function, and then later on we will invoke that function in the context of some on-change scripts. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say this dot value is equal to check case this dot value, and that same bit of code can be picked up and reused in other fields as well. So I'm actually putting it into 3 separate fields: the first name, the last name, and the middle name fields. And if I now have a look at that, go into a person, and if I click on my person Gareth Clement Stickings and click change, and I type in Stickings all in uppercase, you can see that it's corrected it. And if I put in a middle name of Anne in lowercase, we can see that that's been corrected and moved over into the correct case as well. So it's working on these fields, and that's great. It's not without its problems though. This particular example, I've defined a function in a particular place, but there are other places where that same rule needs to be defined. After all, if but this will work fine if I'm creating a new person. So for example, if I create a new person, or will it? Oh, here we have a problem. If I enter in Richards, all in uppercase, Jeff, all in lowercase, and enter those person names, it's thought that it's found a few people. Well, actually, I'm going to ignore that and enter the name. But these fields are not picking up the fact that they're wrong. I should have a capital J. I should only have a capital R, and everything else should be lowercase. But if I put in another thing into the middle name, you can see that it is there. It's picking up. But actually, it would be a better idea if I could, as a system administrator, go and put the rule here into the into this particular screen as well. So I could put this into the custom content of this screen. Well, if I do that, suddenly I've now got 2 places in which this same rule is defined, but it works fine. This dot value equals check case this dot value. That works brilliantly. I've added in my behavior here, and so it's now going to be working very neatly. But and this is the challenge, is that I have 2 locations that I now need to maintain the code. Well, what are some of the disadvantages that we might have? If I change the function to upgrade it a little bit, to make it a little bit more sophisticated, I'd have to remember to do it in both locations. I might not remember that it needs to be updated in both locations. I could find myself deleting or breaking the code in one location, yet confused as to why it still works in another location. So really, a rule that is defined to be used in multiple locations should only be defined once in one single location. We'll look at how we can start to move to that in a moment. But custom content isn't just about adding in some behavior that is just defining a function that is simply a reference function to be used by onChange. We can use this to force a change on any of the structure of the page as the page has finished loading. So this is a way in which we can say, wouldn't it be interesting to know whether we are in a particular mode to turn off a button, or can't we highlight a particular field? And so if I want to do something like that hide button, so when somebody loads in and say, I want to check who you are and hide a button, we can do this using this concept of binding the script to the moment in which the screen has finished loading. And we do that using the crm.ready method. And it looks a little bit like this. So if I take this function and I go into my customization for my company, and I look at my company box long, and I paste that in here. Now I'm using plain old JavaScript to write the alert out, and what we'll see is it's a little bit peculiar, because it will load the page and then put the message out. Well, that's fine, but we can enhance it a little bit better. If I look now at company, we can see that it's telling us that we're on the company screen. If I change this, which I can look to changing this to using a method that is local and particular to the CRM API. And so this is the advantage of doing this, is so I can remind you that we can use the console to try and evolve our code by saying CRM dot, let's put in info message, and in the info message I can put in the message that I want. Now in this particular case that was just company. Well, what if I wanted to put in a little bit more sophisticated company here? So if I wanted to be, the message would be correct whether the user was using English or whether the user was using French or Dutch, or whether the user was using Spanish or Turkish, for example. So how do I make sure that I've got the translation correct for the user? Well, in which case I can use, again, crm.getTrans to carry out the lookup. And getTrans works in the same way that that we're used to using it inside the system screens, where we need just to be aware of the fact that in customization we can look at translations and look to the idea of going into one of the different tab group now, caption family names. I happen to know there's one called tab names. If I look down here I can see that there's one which is for the company. So you can see that here there'll be one for so we've got company in here. So I'm interested in tab names company. I'll put that in here. Oops, I'll put that in here. So this is tab names, company, and you can see that that writes up the message there. In my case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab that. I'm going to then replace that little bit of code with this, and we've now got a function that will write up company, the caption, onto the screen. So I can go into my definitions within my company, into my company screens, and then into company box long, and I'll just paste that bit of code in here, choose save, and so now this is using CRM Ready to bind the function to the moment in which the page is loaded, and I'm using the idea of getTrans to be able to get hold of the translations to be able to change the prompt in the way that I want. And so if I look to this, you can see it does exactly what we wanted it to do, which is showing us the company info message. So that's binding the scripts to the screen loading, and again, that's using custom content to do this. But that still has a problem in that somebody, very well-meaning, can come along at a later date and they might change the code. They might break the code, or they might delete it accidentally as well. That's all possible as well. We're vulnerable to changes in metadata. So how can we start to have a mechanism that will allow us to reuse code between screens and separate that code from the metadata so that it's not vulnerable to accidental change, an accidental change that breaks the code? Well, this is where we get back to this idea that if we look on any screen, we right mouse click and we view the page source, we see at the top of the page a lot of files being referenced. And I can start and take this code that we've been evolving and move to the idea of a library file. Now that custom content that we first looked at had the problem that we've got multiple points of definition and we need to move to a SPOD, a single point of definition. SPOD is not a particularly attractive name, but it's a good name, single point of definition. And I can do that using a library file. Now this is a technique that is applied, you can go back to any version of Sage CRM, and I can go into my, I need to go into my person screen, and in here look at where I've got my code, and I start to move this out into a external library. Now my code looks like this. Yep, I've got it defined in here. Well, I'll tell you what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of these script tags, and I'm going to save this as a JavaScript file down underneath where I have CRM installed. So I'm going to put this down underneath my custom pages folder. So I'm coming down to www root custom pages, and I'm going to call this person, what should I call it? Person name rules. Person name rules. So if I choose that as person name rules.js and save that, I can confirm that that's properly saved. And here what I'm going to do is I'm going to cheat. I'm going to start using a much nicer development environment. I'm using here Visual Studio to allow me to edit my JavaScript. So here's where I've got my function defined, and this is a file that can be browsed to. It's underneath the path. So under here I can go into get rid of all that, go to custom pages, person name rules. I can browse to that location, so I know where it is. I've got a choice in changing my code, because I don't need to have this code referenced in here anymore. Instead, I can start to reference it directly using this source property. Now, I can either use a fully formed path, or I can use a relative path rather than that. And so I can use an absolute path, or I can use a relative path. If I use an absolute path, I could theoretically be pointing at a file that exists on another server. But if I do, then I'm running the risk of cross-domain scripting. So it's probably better that actually what I'm doing here is I'm just using the idea of a local file, which allows me to go up to the root of where I'm working, then down into Sage CRM, down into the custom pages, and down onto that file. Now that's all I need. That's all I need. I can choose Save. I'm changing it in this file location. And I'll change it as well inside the dedupe screen as well. So if I change that in the person box dedupe, I changed that. The proof that this is still good is if I can now go in and carry out a check case. There are a couple of ways I can prove that the file is being found and referenced. The first is to suck it and see. So literally I can go in and look at my person screen and see, does this work? So if I go off to an existing person, so Clement Sticking's here, and click change and put in here all in capitals Ann and tab off, you can see that that's worked. It's corrected that field. We know that it must be drawing that function definition from the external file. This is brilliant. Of course, the other way I could have checked this is to simply open up the console and done my own test, because check case is a function which now is defined inside this browser page, and so the console allows me to access this, and I can test it out, and you'll see that it will return tests. So that's working. That's good. Now, just to confirm that it is doing what I'm saying it's doing, and I'm not pulling the wool over your head, pulling over your eyes, if we could look at the page source and I go and look for the definition of check case, there won't be a definition of that function anywhere. There is just the referencing of the function in the three fields, because of course what we see here is person name rules being referenced as a file. Now that's great, that's good, but we're still a little bit vulnerable, because what happens if somebody well-meaning comes in here and deletes a character and breaks the path? Well, you can probably work that out, is that would fail to load the library, the function would no longer be present, the code would be broken, and you would have then you'd have no particular, you'd have the business rule not being implemented within the interface when you want it to be implemented. So this raises a question of how do we even make this even better within the context of version 7.2 and version 7.3, and that is through the idea of using a library to contain the files and that library to be automatically catalogued and deployed into the client. Now we can see if I look at my if we look at the source again, we can see at the top of every page we have these libraries being loaded in, and we can create our own files which are automatically loaded in as well. Now, I just happen to have created on my machine an example of this. I haven't. I'll have to create it here. Here you can see I've got my own file. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create this as a reference file that will be loaded in. It needs to be saved into a particular location. But before we do that, I'm going to change something about it, and that is I'm going to introduce the idea of namespacing. Namespacing allows us to create our own way of distinctly grouping functions that we add in together into not only a physical file but also a conceptual object that we can use. So just like if I'm playing around within the interface, I hit F12 and I can use CRM dot, and I use all of these different structures. We can create our own object which is then contained with that. So if I switch over in here, I can start to say var, let's call Jeff's rules dot, and I'm going to call this check case. Oh no, I won't. That's going to call Jeff rules equal to if any existing implementation of Jeff's rules, or it's going to create a new object for myself. That's what I'm doing here. So I'm either adding Jeff's rules to any existing object, or I am creating it as an object myself. If I now change the code that I've got, you can see I'm immediately able to reference it. I can say check case is equal to a function which is basically going to be a method which is being passed a variable which has this behavior. So I now have got my own namespace with a function called checkcase. And if I save this down, so I save this as, I'm going to save this underneath www root, underneath the JS folder, underneath custom, where I can add my person name rules. So I save that as person name rules into that location. It won't immediately be available to me because I have to restart the CRM server. Now, the easiest way of doing this is to do an IIS reset, and hopefully that's not going to blow up my Tomcat server, but let's go into IIS reset. So this is a much quicker and better way than waiting 20 minutes for everything to time out. I'm just stopping my IIS. It'll start back up again. And then I'll log back on. And what we'll find is that every page now includes a reference to our new item. So that's if I log off, log back on. A couple more things I need to do to sort of double check and prove everything, because I need to now change the way in which the function is referenced. But I'm loading this in. And it'll take a moment. So that's loaded in. And while that's loading, if I right mouse click and view the page source, what we can see is in here, if I look for personal name rules, we can see that now that file has been included within the catalogue of all the files that are loaded in. So we've got this available to us. And in fact, if I jump across to something like the company screen, or better still the person screen, well, let's go into a person screen down here, people, and there's Simon Yalto. Here I am in a person screen, and I go into the console. If I start looking, you can see suddenly an object is available to me called Jeff's Rules, which is acting as a namespace. And if I look at check case, I can type in the function and it works as before. But it's obviously I'm referencing it by saying Jeff's Rules.checkCase. Now, what that means is that in terms of implementation, I can now go into each of the screens where I was working. I can look at my company box long, or not company box long, I was in the person screen. If I go into my customization of the person, sorry about that, so I go into administration customization person, look at the person box long, I can get rid of any mention of this within the custom content and just change where I've got a simple reference to check case, Jeff's Rules.checkCase. If I change those three fields, they will all be now working, but there's no hint of this within the custom content. Now we can even improve this still a little bit further. You know, we can even get to a point where we're doing other things with this, but this is really cool that we can now simplify the custom content and allow the customer's system administrator to have essentially a clear run at fiddling around with the custom content themselves, knowing that it's going to reduce the risk of them writing something or changing something that damages the implementation of the rule. And we've now done this, and the behavior will be all correct. So if I log on as a sales user, so here's Brian Little, who logs on, goes and finds a person like Jacqueline Downs, click on Jacqueline Downs, type in a middle name like Anne, tab off, and you can see that it's working. We know that it's working. Bang. So this has referenced the external library and is using this namespace reference to be able to implement the change. All good stuff. And we can take this idea a little bit further because we now know that this is automatically referenced in all screens. So that means that we can build and build and build the library of functions that we find useful throughout the system. So if we've got a charting function that we use, or we're transforming fields in a particular way and we want to be able to transfer multiple fields, we can write a standard function that will do that. And we've talked then about the idea of the namespace reference. Very useful concept. As we are making changes, as we are referencing things, we've got different ways of finding the data that we want. And one last thing that I want to do is start to think about, well, can we look at structures to find things to take advantage of the fact that there are standard IDs and standard ways in which we reference things? And the answer to that is yes, we can take advantage of the fact that when we look at a system page like this, there are standard ways in which the page is laid out. So if I look again at the, let's go at the source, let's do it a slightly different way. Let's go and look at the page. If I right mouse click and I look at the element, we can see here in the way in which the information is presented that it's using clear IDs as well as classes to allow us to identify, that could be used to allow us to identify structures. Now consider this. If I think of a company like Eurolandia, not sure if I can get to Eurolandia here. Let's go to company Eurolandia and find. No, I can't. This user doesn't have access to it. So I'll log off and log on as somebody like Kylie Ward and go off to look at the company Eurolandia. So we look at Eurolandia and we can see down in here we've got a range of different people that we can use. So we've got this company, several people within it, and it would be nice to be able to have a sense of where these people work. So if I look at this person, we can say this person is in sales department. I can look at the next person within the company. I can look at Gareth McDade and I can see which department does he work in. Well, he works in operations. And I can look at another user, another person in here like Zoe, and she's in operations as well, and looking at Sunnydale, and they're in support. So I've got one person in support, one person in sales, and two people in that. So this is really useful. If I'm the system administrator, though, I can add in, a little way of graphically representing which departments people in. Now, this is the function that I'm going to use here, the system behavior that I'm going to use here is old behavior. And it's the sort of thing that you might find in an upgraded system. And it's a reference to an organization chart. So I'm going to say org chart here, and I'm going to use the idea of the person organization chart. So I'll add that in and I'll move that up. Oh, I'm choosing it in the wrong place. Let me cancel that. Let's put this into the level of the company, but it is the person org chart that I want to use. So I go into the tab, into the company, and I put in org chart here. So this is using the person org chart. I will add that in, move that up next to the people and choose Save. And so if I go up to the level of the company again, we can see there I've got a chart that says org chart. Now there's a number of things which really aren't particularly satisfactory about this old function. So this is an old bit of behavior that is deprecated, but it's still quite nice because obviously it's nice to have a graphical representation of the company, and it doesn't look too bad. But these buttons, for example, really are funny nonsense behavior. They don't work right, and if I look at all related companies, it's not relationships that we know. It's old behavior, but the core of this chart is useful. Sage CRM builds its pages in a fairly standard way, and this is a sort of fairly funky tip that I'm giving you here. If we look at the for example, inspect the element here, what we'll find is that we are within a structure that we can take advantage of. We can identify that we're in a particular place, like zoom heading, that would allow us to change and control areas of the page. Now maybe that doesn't look particularly meaningful to you, but if I open up a little bit of code here and look at this file, what we'll see that this is a bit of JavaScript that is using the idea of CRM Ready to run a function when the page is loaded. It's then using a method called getArgs to be able to look at the context in which it finds itself. Now it can use getArgs to be able to work out which mode am I in on a screen, which system action am I using. So it can look at the circumstances of the page, and here you can see I'm checking to see which system action I'm on. Well, you might notice that up here I'm on system action 242. So this is the system action that it's doing. And what it's doing is it's then allowing us to hide old buttons and redundant areas of the screen, and then add in new buttons which are linking to the correct way of adding a new person, correct way of referencing relationships, and even adding a print button that will allow us to generate this chart as something that is printable and referenceable. So this is good. This is a fairly nice idea. But all I need to do now is, of course, to save this as, what do I need to save it as? Well, a JS file. So I save that as a JS file, and if I close this and I log out here as well, what I need to do is to restart again. So I need to do an IIS reset in order to have that file recatalogued within Sage CRM. Now while that's doing that, let's see if anyone has got any questions. And I notice that some questions have come in. Can you conditionally, the question is, can you conditionally load namespaces for different categories of entities, or is it all or nothing? Well, just as you can see here, that you can you get close to that idea by being able to define things for use later on once the page is loaded in. You can do a bit of using the idea of the knowledge of the query strings to define your namespace in the way that you want. It'll still be loading the library, but you can define what's in the library at any particular point. I hope, Jeremy, that you started to see that within the code that we were looking at. just because you can look at the argument to see where am I, what's my circumstances, I can then define my object in the way that I need it to be. Okay, well, I've restarted. I can now log back on, and I need to log back on as the system administrator here, and I need to log back on as Kylie Ward here. So we've got, now if we right mouse click, view let's right mouse click and view the page source, we will see that if I look down through here at the custom references, we can see that in addition to our person name rules, we have got the org chart file being loaded in. And now if I go off to look at a company like Eurolandia and I look to the org chart, what we will find is that suddenly it's a lot neater. There's none of the redundant information displayed here, and we've got these new buttons which perform different tasks like printing this image, so we can then, well, right mouse click and I can copy that for putting into a spreadsheet, or printing it into a document, or printing it onto the printer even. So it's a useful tool to be able to do this. And that's all been done to take an old feature and rejuvenate it using client-side code, just because of the structured way in which the CRM pages are used. And this is also showing you how our code in this particular case can mix plain old JavaScript with the client-side API, plus a little bit of cleverness with jQuery as well, to be able to get the thing that we want. Now we're getting close to the end of the page. We've started to, that last exercise actually discussed questions about mode and where are we, because we can use the idea of the arguments to be able to work that out. In fact, we can look to individual fields to see whether they are in edit mode, not just by looking at the system action. We can see here that there is this, on the individual field, the idea of get mode as a method which will return either whether we are in edit mode or view mode to tell whether that field is editable. But you can also use the get args to work out where you are. But before I finish off, I do want to point out that there's a whole set of resources available on the community all about the client-side API. There's a lot of stuff out there. So if I look at Roundup, Roundup is the key phrase that everyone needs to use. So you have a look at client-side API in Sage CRM 7.2 and 7.3, a roundup of articles. Here we can see that there's a whole stack of different things about explaining how to do things, how to change things, and we haven't even touched on half of the things that we can do with this. We haven't looked at being clever with Ajax, we've not done charting, we've not done this, and you're probably wondering, well, Jeff, where can we get a convenient example to do this? Well, again, you look at, you're a member of the developer community, and what you can do is go into developer downloads, and the main area that you're wanting to go to is the developer downloads and components. And within the developer downloads and components, it's one of the first things that I always update for a version, is the idea of this client-side plugin or client-side library example, and you've got both a library that you can download and a guide that you can download. The guide will tell you how to do this, and actually if we download that, it'll tell you and hopefully that'll spring open. There he goes, and opening in now. So we have a PDF file which will tell you how to go about and use the files, where to put them, and what you can expect the business files, the business rules to be doing. In my case, what I've got in my system, I've already downloaded the files, I've unzipped them, and you can see that they're actually here. These are these files. So I'm just going to rename them to be my JS file, and I need to rename this to be a JS file as well. And what this will do once, and you can probably guess what I have to do here, so I have to do an IIS reset to have those catalogued, and these will have an immediate effect within my interface. So a user, someone like Brian Little, if I shut down some of these items and log off, we'll see an immediate impact in the way that they will work with the system. You can see that that's restarted, and I should be able to log on. Waiting for that to start up. And it's taking a little bit of time. I always hope that I won't have to There you go. So here you can see very dramatically changes have been made inside the user interface. We can see that these examples of code that we've got here, and this is this particular example that I'm using, has got examples of how all of these bits of change have been made. You just need to look down to the appropriate system action that is being referenced here. This is the system. This is the action associated with the opportunity list. Knowing that that's how it's done, we can see that there are changes in the company. We can see that, for example, the field is highlighted. We've got obviously up here. Suddenly, I've forgotten that chart appears in the top right. We've got the listing out of the a hyperlink to open up a Google search for the particular company. So we have a look at the information there, and if I go and look at over here, we have a look at the idea of buttons that we've added in, new button like the Sage CRM Community News, and you can be exact about where you want to put a button or a new tab or new structure into the page. It gives you a lot of control over this, and it's important to realize that teaching by example and being able to look at some real world things allows you to take this a little bit further. And if we go and have a look at the opportunities underneath this company, if I go into here, we can see that we've got, for example, some dynamic drawing of charts on the screen, and we've got as well the idea of some Ajax being used to pull back information, because that status and active status and type information is not on the screen. That actually has to be pulled from the database using Ajax. So you've got lots of useful little examples in here to take you on and how to use the power of the client-side API. Okay, I've covered quite a lot of ground in today's lesson. Hopefully I've proven to you that it is an extremely useful API. I hope that satisfies a lot of your curiosity with that, and that you are able to look at the material, look at the resources associated with this lesson that I've indicated, and when you download them you'll be able to take them and use them for your own education. Well, thank you very much for coming along. I've come to the end of the session. Let's see if anyone has got any questions.